Chapter 2 My First War Patrol. My wartime adventure aboard U-505 began on February 11th, 1942, with a rather ceremonious departure from Lorient. The crew members who were not on watch assembled in narrow parade formation on the upper deck. The rest of us manned our maneuver stations below. I was desperate not to make a mistake on the beginning of this, our boat's first true combat patrol. The skipper and the men on watch stood clustered on the bridge, the top of which was decorated with garlands of flowers for the occasion. A wave of excitement washed over us all when Capitaine Lieutenant Löwe shouted the order to cast off lines. The removal of the mooring ropes was the Navy band's cue to begin a farewell serenade of military marches. 3 loud cheers of hurrah erupted from the dockside audience and echoed off the walls of the dimly lit bunker. With that, at precisely 1800 hours, our boat began to slowly back out of the black, oily waters of the submarine pen into Lorient harbor. Once clear of our berth, we were joined by U-68 for the trip to the departure point. In the outer harbor we met our escort, a small minesweeper. The music and cheers gradually faded into the silence as our little flotilla made its way to Port Louis, the last cusp of friendly land we would see for quite a while. Capitaine Lieutenant Löwe turned to the executive officer and said, "Neulau, throw the flowers overboard." According to old German naval tradition, it was bad luck to carry flowers out of sight of land. Oberleutnant Lieutenant J.G. Neulau nodded in agreement, and over the side the flowers went. No one wanted to offend old King Neptune on our first sortie against the enemy. When the ocean depth reached 200 meters, we made our final deep test drive, a precautionary procedure performed by all submarines departing on a war patrol. After a successful test, we resurfaced and signaled to our escorts, "Everything okay." They signaled back, "Safe return and good hunting," before turning back toward the harbor. We were now on our own. Our diesels roared up to flank speed, and U-505's bow began cutting its way through the choppy waters of the Bay of Biscay. The afternoon departure time had been calculated to give us maximum cover of darkness to traverse the bay. The Brits maintained constant surface and air patrols designed to catch departing or returning submarines moving through the area. We would soon come to call the place the U-boat graveyard, because of all the unfortunate subs sunk here. By the end of the war, most U-boats never got a chance to engage the enemy before they were snared by the Allies' cordon of death around our submarine sally ports. Despite our fears regarding what awaited us in the Battle of the Atlantic, we were determined not to be caught here and sunk before we had drawn blood. Not long after our escort disappeared, we heard the click of the intercom. Everyone cocked their ear towards the nearest speaker to better hear the message over the reverberating clamor of the diesels. "This is the Capitaine Lieutenant. We have been ordered to hunt along the West African coast. Our operational area will be the Allies' convoy assembly point off Freetown Harbor. We will be going up against fast ships, and it certainly won't be easy. In the meantime, keep your eyes open and be alert. That is all." Few of us in the crew had ever heard of Freetown. We were told it was a port in Sierra Leone, and that it was a major refueling point for Allied supply convoys headed towards the North African front. We were pleased to learn we would be taking a direct role in helping Rommel and his Africa Corps fight against the Tommies. Just then we received an FT, radio telegraph message. ordering us to turn around and assist one of our sister boats that had just been heavily damaged in an air attack off the Spanish coast. Some of us younger crew members seethed in frustration. We wanted to be warriors, not nursemaids or ambulance drivers. Only later, with experience and maturity, did we learn that one who saves lives is as heroic as one who kills the enemy. The whole matter blew over, however, when a little later the news reached us that the damaged U-boat had safely reached a Spanish port under its own power. We resumed our course for the West African coast. We had a number of alarm dives during our transit through the Bay of Biscay because of approaching enemy aircraft. This was the true test of any submarine crew: to plunge the boat beneath the waves to a safe depth before the diving enemy bombers had a chance to drop their deadly loads. Our hearts pounded louder than our diesels during the first few encounters we had with those buzzards, but in a surprisingly short time these dives became absolutely routine. Occasionally we heard the detonation of depth charges exploding over our heads, but they were never close enough to cause us any serious worry or damage. Once we cleared the Bay of Biscay, things loosened up a bit. After we passed the Azores, we shut down one diesel and ran at half speed in order to conserve fuel. The Capitaine Lieutenant even allowed 3 men at a time to join the bridge watch and have a smoke. What a joy it was to stand on the bridge with a good cigarette and the warm African breeze in one's face. Back home in Germany, our families would still be huddled around the fireplace at this time of year. Before long, however, the warmth turned from a blessing into a curse. As we crossed the Tropic of Cancer, the boat began to heat up like a furnace during the daytime. German submarines were not equipped with air conditioners, so we used every imaginable excuse to get out onto the deck and escape the roasting temperature inside the hull. When we dived, the ocean water cooled the pressure hull, causing drops of condensation to rain down upon us. We switched to a very casual tropical uniform: khaki canvas shorts and no shirt. We donned a broad-brimmed pith helmet when we were topside. Soon we all had skin as brown as African natives. The tropical heat began to make our food stores spoil much sooner than expected. For example, upon our departure from Lorient, we had taken on 3,000 eggs. In the chilly waters of the North Atlantic, eggs could be counted on to last 2 or 3 months before getting rotten. In this torrid climate, however, the eggs began to rot after only a couple of weeks. The skipper decided that we should try to consume them as quickly as possible, and announced that we could eat as many of them as we wished every mealtime. Well, some of the boys on board really liked eggs and began eating literally dozens of them daily. After a few days, though, no one could even stand the sight of the little white devils. For many of us, the mere smell of eggs was repulsive for many years afterward. Those were lazy days as we slowly prodded southward. During the cool, clear nights, we would sit on the deck and stare at the Southern Cross, telling every story from our civilian lives we could remember. At first it all seemed very idyllic to be sailing under these strange constellations towards our unknown fate. But after 3 weeks out of Lorient, the boring routine began to grate on my nerves. The unending cycles of watch, trying to read with condensation water dripping on the pages of my English language textbook, someone telling his old story for the 10th time, the same phonograph record playing for the 100th time. For young guys like us, this inactivity was a kind of slow psychological torture. Of course, torture can be of the physical variety, too. I was smaller and younger than most of the others, and therefore had to take my fair share of teasing and hazing before being fully accepted as one of the crew. I was also less experienced than they were because I had missed U-505's initial journey from Kiel to Lorient. The biggest challenge to me was gaining my sea legs. During storms, the boat would often rock 60 degrees from side to side. In situations like that, even if you were deathly seasick, you had to perform your duties perfectly. We were well aware that some boats never returned to base because of one little mistake by someone in the control room. In a way, I was lucky that first patrol was so rough, because if you learn the hard way, it becomes easier later on. Some men never got used to the motion and pressure changes of a submarine. One petty officer reluctantly returned to duty on destroyers because he simply could not adjust to the rigors of submarine life. At any rate, after a few weeks at sea, I got a promotion in my control room duties. The skipper moved me from my periscope pump operator's position to the diving manifold operator's position a few feet away. My new duties were much more complex, as I was responsible for controlling the water level in the numerous diving tanks. The tanks needed to be blown out with air or filled with water in a precisely timed sequence lest the boat lose pitch control. Except for occasional emergencies when I assisted the diesel engine crew make repairs, this was to be my duty position for the rest of my wartime career aboard U-505. During our transit to the Freetown operational area, we had several sightings of smoke plumes from enemy convoys. Naturally, we gave chase. However, patrolling British aircraft, usually one of the big four-engined Sunderland flying boats, always managed to spot us before we got into firing range. Once we were forced to emergency dive, it was easy for the enemy ships to slip away because U-505's electric motors gave us a cruising speed of only 7 knots underwater. Unless we were already perfectly positioned in the path of a convoy, this was far too slow to catch up with a target and conduct an attack. Captain Lieutenant Löwe would be left watching through the periscope, muttering in frustration as the convoy disappeared into the distance. A couple of times aircraft didn't spot us, which allowed us to stay on the surface and use our faster diesel engines to chase a target. But even at top speed, we were only a few knots faster than most convoys. Therefore, we would try to maneuver in front of their anticipated course in order to intercept them. A few times we ran the diesels at dangerously high speeds in order to catch a convoy, but a fortuitous change of direction always saved the enemy ships from an attack. You cannot imagine the excitement we crewmen felt during these chases. Finally, we thought, we will get our first hit. But eventually we would hear the roaring diesels reduced to normal speed again, and the skipper would apologize to us over the intercom for guessing the convoy's course wrong. At those moments the crew's mood barometer would drop to 0, and all of the built-up frustrations and petty feuds of the past few weeks would come flooding back. Suddenly, once again, you became conscious of the heat and the noise and the stench of whatever shit our cook was preparing for dinner. With such a young green crew on his hands, Captain Lieutenant Löwe knew we needed a kill, as much for crew morale as for the war effort. In an attempt to provide us with some diversion, the skipper began to organize our off-duty hobbies into ship-wide tournaments. Chess and card games were the most popular contests. My favorites were the trivia games, where we would try to name the capitals of foreign countries or answer history questions. Winners were allowed to skip a watch duty or given an extra scoop of dessert as a reward. These games helped a lot, but everyone from the skipper on down knew there was no cure for morale problems like a few victory pennants flying from the conning tower. As we entered our operational area off the West African coast, Allied air activity stepped up considerably. The planes buzzed over our heads like swarms of hornets. They forced us to emergency dive uncounted times. But no one cared about the increased danger as long as it meant we had a better chance to sink some enemy ships. On the morning of March 8, 1942, we finally arrived at our patrol station off Sierra Leone. Now, we thought, it's them or us. We searched in vain all day for signs of the enemy. Then, at 1836 hours, one of the sharp-eyed boys on the bridge watch spotted something on the horizon. It was an enemy freighter piled high with cargo heading on a general course for Freetown. She was running at 12 knots, zigzagging with lights dimmed. It took us 4 full hours to finally catch up with her and maneuver into attack position. The tension inside the control room was excruciating as we made the final preparations for firing. My own heart was beating wildly with excitement as I adjusted the boat's trim to compensate for the flooding of the torpedo tubes. After all the training and hard work, after all the tedious waiting, at long last we were going to strike against the enemy. We all strained to hear the whispers of the firing crew as they calculated range and speed. Finally, at a range of 600 meters, we heard Captain Lieutenant Leva's deep voice boom out the words, "Torpedoes los!" Torpedoes away. With a hiss and a shudder, 2 torpedoes leapt from their tubes. We waited breathlessly as the seconds ticked by to the estimated time of impact. Then, nothing. For some reason, both torpedoes missed the target. The skipper didn't give us time to get depressed. We felt an abrupt change of course and heard the diesels once again rev up to flank speed. There was heavy phosphorescence in the sea, our churning propellers leaving a huge curving trail of eerie green light in our wake. Our nerves were taut as violin strings. Anger now joined the medley of other emotions sweeping through our hearts. Caution be damned, we must get that freighter. The sudden ringing of the machine telegraph bell made a few of us jump. The ringing meant new orders were being transmitted for course and speed, new numbers being dialed in for the torpedo data computer. No one talked. Our emotions were communicated to each other through our eyes. The hammering clamor of the diesels seemed to fade to silence as the firing commands were given. Tube 2, distance 400 meters, depth 3 meters. Torpedo los! We all joined in to chant the torpedo timing count. 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. Boom! The explosion. The torpedo hit the steamer amidships, stopping her dead in her tracks. Lifeboats were lowered, and a large night beacon buoy was deployed. A brave radio man still on board the steamer started broadcasting a frantic SOS. From his messages, we discovered the ship was the British freighter Ben More, 5,920 tons. The Ben More was settling into the water, but very slowly. Once all men had left the ship and the lifeboats had cleared the area, Leva ordered another torpedo to be used for the coup de grace. The eel, which was our slang word for torpedo, was fired point-blank from a distance of 300 meters. It hit directly under the bridge, and the freighter began to break in two. By 23:47 hours there was nothing left floating on the surface except the lifeboats and a curious assortment of debris. We were so close to our target that we could plainly see the survivors huddled in the boats. We were relieved that no one appeared to be injured. It may seem strange, but despite our countries being traditional enemies, we felt no hatred toward the British seamen. We were fascinated by the awesome destruction we had wrought, but we had no desire to see our brother sailors harmed. In a way, it was like watching an automobile race. One loves to see a good crash, but at the same time hopes that no one gets hurt. But there was no time to contemplate our first victory, for the moon was bright and we had to make good our escape. Satisfied the Brits were all right, Löwe ordered us out of the area at top speed. We were very busy at our duty stations, but everyone was jubilant. All of the trials and frustrations we experienced earlier in the mission were forgotten. Sinking a fully loaded freighter on our first mission, we decided, was a good omen. The very next morning we sighted another smoke plume drifting leeward over the horizon. The sudden appearance overhead of a British Sunderland interrupted our chase, but a few hours later we spotted the smoke again. Dead ahead, emerging from a heavy rain squall, was a large tanker running zigzags at 10 knots. Her general course was the same as the freighter from yesterday. She was not flying a flag, but a quick glance at the recognition book revealed her to be a British Confidence-class tanker, approximately 8,000 tons. Best of all, she was lying low in the water, fully loaded with oil destined for the enemy's forces in North Africa. We positioned ourselves for attack and submerged, waiting for our prey to come to us. By the time Kapitän-Leutnant Löwe raised the attack periscope, we were so close, less than 200 meters away, that only 1/3 of the target could be seen in the scope's field of vision. We had to hurry before the tanker got so close that we would be endangered by our own torpedo's explosion. Torpedo depth 4 meters, bearing 130. The forward torpedo control room mate flooded the tubes, and we adjusted the boat's trim for the shift in weight. In the drama of the moment, everything seemed to be moving in slow motion. I envisioned the torpedo officer's fist raised over the red firing button like a guillotine blade hanging over the head of a condemned man. We all held our breath, waiting for the inevitable order to fire. The tension was unbearable. What the hell were they waiting for? Then, at last, the order, Torpedo 5, los! Torpedo 6, los! With a loud hiss of air pressure, the long black eels shot out of the tubes on their mission of destruction. Time, 11:31 hours. At this range, we couldn't miss. Could we? Again we began counting down the seconds until impact. 7, 8, 9. A sharp explosion was followed immediately by a deafening roar. A moment later, a gigantic shock wave hit us, knocking us off our feet and rocking the boat like a baby's cradle. Huge waves blocked the periscope's vision for almost 2 minutes. When the periscope view finally cleared, all that could be seen was an enormous plume of white smoke. The tanker, which had evidently been loaded with gasoline, had exploded like a bomb when the torpedoes hit. Inside the sub we could still hear low, rumbling explosions several minutes after the first detonation. The blast wave caused some minor damage to our diesel clutch. Repairs were accomplished quickly, and Kapitän-Leutnant Löwe ordered battle stations surface. As soon as the conning tower cleared the surface, the skipper and the rest of the watch crew popped open the hatch and clambered out onto the bridge. All that could be seen was scattered debris and a huge, quickly spreading oil slick where the tanker had once been. Then, incredibly, the bridge watch spotted some survivors. There were about 20 of them, thickly covered in oil, paddling toward us in a lifeboat and 2 rafts. Löwe maneuvered our boat closer to render aid to the dazed survivors, many of whom had suffered burns. We gave them fresh water, food, medicine, and bandages. The grateful sailors told us the tanker was the Südhof, bound for Freetown. We had no sooner found out the name of the tanker when another Sunderland was spotted approaching from the east, range about 8,000 meters. Satisfied that we had done all we could for the survivors, we made good our escape. After the war, we found out the aircraft had somehow missed seeing both our boat and the giant oil slick, but at the time we had to assume we'd been detected. The next 2 days were spent in fruitless search for more targets. We were repeatedly forced to dive to escape from approaching aircraft. Our 2 sinkings had obviously disturbed a hornet's nest, and now an angry swarm of enemy planes blackened the skies above us. A fierce tropical storm finally grounded our tormentors, giving us a brief respite to surface and reload torpedoes into the forward tubes. Torrential showers and a heavy swell hindered our work, but the main problem was a faulty upper deck plate built in Lorient. It was our first experience with sabotage by the shipyard workers of Lorient, a problem that would become much more frequent and serious as the war progressed. After 2 hours of back-breaking labor, we finished loading the torpedoes and slipped into relative safety under the waves. It was just plain good luck that no aircraft had seen us. Only 1 year later, with increased Allied air activity, being stranded on the surface for 2 hours like that would have meant certain destruction. Our first 2 kills had whetted our appetite for combat, but we were becoming victims of our own success. Allied merchant traffic was scared away from the area. Occasionally we would encounter a neutral ship or Allied destroyers on patrol, but no freighters or tankers that we were in a position to attack. Radio messages from Fregattenkapitein, Navy Commander Karl Mertens U-68, which was also operating in the Freetown area, reported a similar situation. No targets. Eventually, our frustrated skipper radioed the headquarters of Admiral Dönitz, the commander of all U-boat forces, asking permission to sail across the narrow waist of the Atlantic to strike at shipping coming out of South America. Leuve's request was refused, however, due to the delicate political situation there. So we were left to ply the steamy African waters in a vain attempt to locate enemy ships. Unfortunately, there was never a shortage of enemy aircraft. Several times a day we were forced to emergency dive to escape from the damned planes. The sheer physical and emotional effort expended by so many crash dives began to wear us down. Submariners of today cannot imagine the complex operations required of a crew to emergency dive in a World War II boat. When the alarm signal was received over the machine telegraph, many dozens of hand wheels and valves had to be sequentially operated, all to a precise degree in the hot, crowded control room of our boat. You had to push and shove each other out of the way to make hasty adjustments of the instruments. There was no time for emotions or apologies. Just get your job done and get it done right the first time. There wasn't even time to fully explain orders. Usually a hand signal or a single word had to suffice. Only the Lord in heaven knows how many boats went down for the last time because of a simple mistake or misunderstanding. For the next several days we had zero success. We spotted a few distant ships moving at high speed, and once we even managed to fire a couple of torpedoes at long range, but failed to score a hit. We continued on a generally southern course along the coast of Africa. The days began to blur in our minds into one unending steaming hell. It was during this time that we experienced our first real baptism of fire on the receiving end. In the very early morning hours of March 29th, we spotted a suspicious shadow lurking in a rain squall. The vessel turned out to be a freighter, but with an unusual silhouette. Löwe decided to play it safe and pursue the ship under water. We chased the zigzagging target for more than 4 hours, but with our slow electric motors we could not close the distance between us. At 0550 hours the bright moon set, giving us a short window of opportunity to make a surface attack before the sun rose. We surfaced and started the diesels when suddenly an aircraft appeared, illuminating our general vicinity with blindingly bright searchlights. A moment later another aircraft appeared 300 meters to our starboard, flying parallel to our course. The second aircraft began signaling to the ship with recognition lights. Then both the steamship and the airplane made abrupt turns, heading directly toward us. This was more than enough for Löwe, who knew a trap when he saw one. We immediately alarm dived and made evasive maneuvers. After 20 minutes of silence, we rose to periscope depth to take a look. If the planes were gone, perhaps we could still make an underwater attack on the suspicious freighter. No sooner had the periscope broken the surface, however, than we all heard the unmistakable pings of a warship's ASDIC underwater detection device. Well, ASDIC pings are like a woman's labor pains. The shorter the interval between them, the closer the moment of truth. These pings were getting closer, and at a very alarming rate. The skipper immediately ordered a crash dive to 100 meters. We had barely passed the 40-meter depth point when 4 gigantic explosions rocked the boat. Now we really understood what a depth charge sounded like at close range. After 10 minutes of maneuvering, the pings began to gradually fade into the distance. We concluded the ship was an U-boat Falla, one of the heavily armed merchant Q ships used as decoys by the British to ambush our subs. After we were sure of our safety, the intercom clicked on and Löwe made an announcement. At this moment, I wish to compliment the crew on their performance during our boat's baptism of fire. Sometimes in war, he reminded us, the hunters are successful, but other times they themselves get hunted. We will head farther south. U-505 has caused enough turbulence in this area. That is all. Surviving our close shave with the Q ship was a relief, but it galled us that we had been chased from the area without us being able to fire even one shot. To us younger members of the crew, the incident just added insult to injury for the past 3 weeks without a victory. Emergency diving several times a day to escape from aircraft caused fatigue and frustrations, which also began to tear at our nerves. With no success to show for all of our labors, our crowded boat became a pressure cooker of emotions. Off-duty personnel began to succumb to Blechkoller, the so-called tin can disease, a psychological condition caused by prolonged confinement. Its classic symptoms were the outbreak of baloney quarrels between boys who argue and fight over nothing. Situations like these separate a real leader from a mere giver of orders, and Kapitän Leutnant Löwe now showed himself to be a commander of the first rank. He sensed the mood of the crew and decided to create a little mental diversion during this lull in the action. Stretching his orders a bit, Löwe ordered U-505 south of our official operational area. On April 1st, we crossed the equator, an occasion requiring the crew to undergo the ancient baptism rituals of Neptune. The ceremony was celebrated on the upper deck of the boat with the entire crew in attendance. After an appropriate fanfare, King Neptune appeared on the bridge to preside over the rituals, complete with flowing beard and trident. An extra touch of hilarity was provided by our baby-faced ensign, who had the embarrassing task of portraying Neptune's lovely mermaid wife. The other veteran sea dogs in the crew, also dressed in makeshift costumes, took devilish delight in subjecting us first-timers to a wide variety of elaborate rituals with good-natured tortures. Quite a lot of water and rough scrubbing was required to wash the dirt of the northern hemisphere off our skins before we could enter the southern half of King Neptune's empire. Of course, we were told, it was also necessary to be cleaned out on the inside, too. Depending on how many bad points one had collected, we were each required to eat a certain number of specially prepared laxative balls made of flour and castor oil. Pepper and other evil-tasting spices were added to the mixture to enhance the entertainment. If we couldn't swallow the golf ball-sized pills without chewing, we were assisted in the endeavor by a water hose in the mouth. Then we would pull down our shorts and crawl out onto a long plank extending from the side of the boat. There we sat on a large hole drilled through the plank until the castor oil provided the final amusement. Without a doubt, it was the most foolish and memorable April 1st any of us would ever experience. When it was all over, we each received an award document from King Neptune attesting to our accomplishment. It may sound strange, but getting that silly little piece of paper did much to fulfill the Kapitänleutnant's very serious purpose of raising our morale. The morning after the ceremony was a quiet one. We spent the hours test diving and setting the trim while we recovered from our digestive distress. Except for an alarm dive around noon caused by the appearance of a Sunderland, nothing happened until that evening. At 16:22 hours we spotted a steamer to the west, headed on a generally southern bearing. The appearance of an escort vessel in its company, however, convinced our skipper that a night attack would be the safest course of action. At 21:50 hours we fired 2 torpedoes at the target, range 1,000 meters. Both torpedoes either missed or failed to explode. For the next 10 hours we tried to line up another attack, but heavy squalls limited our visibility to less than 100 meters. Eventually we lost contact. This situation, as we used to say, was about as productive as milking mice. The Kapitänleutnant placed us on a curving search pattern for the target. The next morning we reacquired the elusive steamer and moved into a firing position in front of her. Just as we submerged to make the attack, however, another steamer appeared, sailing in the opposite direction. Unfortunately, the second steamer was flanked by 2 escort vessels. Nevertheless, Löwe decided to go for the more heavily protected newcomer because it had a more favorable firing angle. Besides, he reasoned, such a heavily guarded ship might be carrying more valuable cargo. At 2100 hours we lined up for a surface attack on the steamer with 2 escorts. They were steering directly toward us. Indeed, one of the escorts was actually on a collision course with us. Löwe, with his nerves of steel, waited until the escort was only 400 meters away before he swung our boat sharply to the right and let loose with 2 torpedoes at the merchantman. According to our timing count, the first torpedo missed, but the second struck home with a thundering explosion. A tall column of water, gleaming white in the moonlight, sprouted from the water line just forward of the bridge. Damage must have been massive, because the ship immediately began to sink bow first. The steamer broadcasted a short SOS message from which we learned its name, West Irmo, 5,775 tons. With two angry escorts looking for revenge, this clearly was no place to loiter. We promptly turned tail and made good our escape. The stricken steamer quickly disappeared into the darkness, but in the distance we could plainly hear the dull booms of her boilers exploding on her way to the bottom. Our sinking of the West Irmo once and for all ended morale problems aboard our boat. It felt like someone had lifted a heavy weight from our chest. Especially satisfying was the way we had sunk the ship right under the noses of the escorts, escaping without so much as one shot being fired against us. We felt we had erased the Q ship's insult and were as proud as roosters. Captain Lieutenant Löwe had a hunch there were other prey in the area. Sure enough, at 14:07 hours, the very next day, our eagle-eyed boys on the bridge spotted a smudge of smoke far to the south of us. The ship had a 25 nautical mile lead on us, but our entire crew, without exception, had full confidence this would be another success. It was getting late by the time we caught her, so the skipper decided to use the same sort of night surface attack tactics that had served us so well the day before. We trailed the steamer just outside of her sight range, careful to keep the bow of U-505 constantly pointed towards our target so as to present the narrowest possible silhouette. At 2100 hours we heard the click of the intercom, heralding the announcement we had been so eagerly anticipating. Löwe's deep, steady voice ordered, "Aufgefechtstationen," battle stations, sending a thrill deep through each of our souls. Our hearts swelled with unbounded pride and confidence in our skipper and ourselves. Somehow the shared labors, dangers, triumphs, and even the silliness of the Neptune ceremony had combined in a mysterious alchemy to produce a mature and professional crew committed to enduring any hardship or danger in the service of our country. It was a magical process, one that we were not fully conscious of, but at that moment we all felt it. With the Diesels running full speed, we caught up with the ship in less than 30 minutes. A single torpedo was fired from a distance of 800 meters, hitting the ship slightly astern. The steamer sank quickly, her bow hanging high in the air as she slipped under the waves. Löwe maneuvered our boat close to the lifeboats to render aid. We found out from the survivors that the ship was a Dutch merchantman named the Alpaca, 5,759 tons, carrying wool from Cape Town to Freetown. The survivors had escaped from the sinking ship without casualties, and their lifeboats were well provisioned with supplies. Our skipper's conversation with the survivors, in English and German, was remarkably cordial given the circumstances. The Dutch crew thanked us for our help, and even wished us farewell and bon voyage. As we left the area, we pondered the irony of fate that had pitted our country against such a friendly people who spoke our own language. We departed the scene of the sinking headed on a fake course. Once out of the survivors' sight range, we resumed our generally northern track. Since the Alpaca did not have time to send a distress signal over her wireless, our skipper believed that Allied merchant traffic in the area might still be unaware of our presence. The next couple of days were spent quietly, another transfer of torpedoes from the storage tubes into the bow torpedo room being the only event worthy of note. On the morning of April 6th, however, we all got quite a scare. We were cruising on the surface when suddenly the bridge watch shouted the aircraft alarm, "Flieger!" A Sunderland was flying a course directly toward us. Löwe ordered us to dive, but the air relief valve for one of the diving tanks refused to open. The stuck valve not only prohibited us from submerging, but also caused a dramatic imbalance of weight within the sub. Within seconds, U-505 was stranded on the surface with its bow buried deep under water and its stern sticking high up into the air at a 40-degree angle. We were absolutely helpless to escape from the approaching Sunderland. Lightning-fast reactions by Chief Engineering Officer Fritz Förster managed to temporarily free the valve. Meanwhile, the skipper ordered all crewmen to run to the stern end of the boat to help even the imbalance of weight. We all held our breath as the stern slowly began to descend back into the water, wondering when the Sunderland would attack. Luckily, it did not attack before we had a chance to escape. We resurfaced at 14:30 hours. All sorts of gallows humor enlivened our work as we repaired the relief valve. The best joke was that the English pilot failed to attack because he thought U-505 was an ostrich with its head buried in the water and its tail sticking up in the air. The grim humor masked the fact that we came very close to being killed, either by the Sunderland or by an uncontrolled plunge to the bottom of the ocean. The incident also served to increase our respect for our engineering officer's technical skill and Kapitänleutnant Löwe's cool self-control. Not once during the entire emergency did the skipper raise his voice in either anger or fear. Things quieted down considerably for the rest of the patrol. We made a few more sightings of ships, but were usually unable to catch them. When we did catch them, they turned out to be either neutral or British destroyers, which Kapitänleutnant Löwe discreetly declined to challenge. Of course, there was no let-up of the harassment from the air. Alarm dives were a daily affair, sometimes involving very narrow escapes from bombs or depth charges. On April 18th, one of the Sunderland big birds laid an egg close enough to cause us some minor damage. By the end of April, our boat and crew were both showing signs of exhaustion. The diesel engines were badly in need of an overhaul, and fuel was getting critically low. Indeed, we did not even have sufficient fuel reserves to give chase to any more targets without endangering our ability to return to base. Also, some of the crew were displaying skin eruptions and symptoms of scurvy because of the lack of fresh food on board. It was clearly time to head home. By the beginning of May, our generally northern course had brought us back to the entrance of the Bay of Biscay. Having survived thus far, Löwe was playing it very safe for this last leg of our journey. He ordered the bridge watches to be doubled whenever we were surfaced because of the increased chances of air attack. We also took care to avoid being spotted by the French fishing fleet, who, we suspected, reported the presence of U-boats to the British. Sometimes Löwe seemed to have an uncanny ability to sense danger before it made its presence known. For instance, on the afternoon of May 5th, while we were peacefully cruising on the surface, for no apparent reason, the Kapitänleutnant ordered the diving tanks to be partially filled with water. This precaution, he explained, would minimize the time needed for an emergency dive. Exactly 4 minutes later, a two-engined land-based bomber swooped down at us from nowhere and dropped 9 bombs. Though we escaped without damage, some of the bombs landed close enough for us to find bomb splinters on the bridge when we later resurfaced. The skipper's precaution, based solely on his premonition of danger, had made the difference between life and death for us. From then on, we traveled mostly underwater during the day, surfacing only at night to recharge the batteries. During the night of May 5th, we received an FT radio telegram from 2nd U-boat Flotilla headquarters with details of our rendezvous with the harbor escort craft. Until they met us, our radio directional finder and arc lamp searchlight beams from Lorient would guide us in for the final stretch. On the evening of May 7th, we sighted Ile de Groix, a small island near the mouth of Lorient harbor. A few moments later our escort arrived to guide us to our berth. With 4 victory pennants fluttering over our heads, we proudly sailed the last few miles back to base. Chapter 3. Lorient. An escort ship from Lorient harbor met us at the prearranged rendezvous point just as dawn broke over the horizon. The morning sun warmed our happy faces as we followed the craft back to our armored nest.